Well, let me formally welcome you all to this jointly sponsored seminar from Tower Center and the Devon College Interdisciplinary Institute. My colleague, Professor Bertel, who's here, many of you know. I think some of you are actually in her class, if I'm not mistaken. And we do have a mix, I think, of graduate and undergraduate students here, which is a nice for a change. So maybe the graduate students can interact a little with the undergraduates and vice versa. Also have a number of other colleagues here. There may be some outside members coming in later, but we need to get started. So it's my pleasure to welcome to SMU and to the Tower Center and to Texas, Adrian Favell, whom I have known for a while. I can't remember where we first met. It might have been at the European University Institute or somewhere else in Britain. Adrian has had an interesting career, traveling around the world, having done his degrees initially, I think, in Britain and Sussex, right? Undergraduate?
No, East Anglia.
At East Anglia, but weren't you at Sussex?
No, I taught at Sussex.
Taught at Sussex, okay. But so he is British, but you wouldn't know it if you look at the rest of his curriculum vitae, because he spent a lot of time in different countries in Europe teaching, and he also had a long stint in the United States teaching in the Sociology department at UCLA before returning to Europe, and he's currently appointed at the Institut d'études politiques, Paris, Sciences Po, otherwise known as Sciences Po, where he is teaching sociology, but I see that he's affiliated with the Center for European Studies there. I think of him primarily as a scholar of Europe, and of course someone who has written very widely on issues of immigration and citizenship. I think one of his best-known books, which I have had on my shelf since it appeared, is called The Philosophies of Integration. He's also written a lot about issues of mobility in Europe. I know that's something that interests many of you, especially within the context of the EU. And today he is going to talk about immigration, integration, and mobility, new agendas in European migration studies. I also should point out, before I say another word about that Caroline Bertel and I have had the privilege of working with him on a couple of editions of a book called Migration Theory, which you may be familiar with, in which he wrote a very interesting conclusion about the need to get beyond sort of conventional thinking about migration. The title was Rebooting Migration Theory, and that also appears in this collection, which has exactly the same name of his talk today, which is Immigration, Integration, and Mobility, New Agendas in European Migration Studies, which is just coming out soon with ECPR. It will be in all of the best bookstores, I'm sure. But in this day and age, you can certainly find it online. And I couldn't resist. I did write a blurb for the book in which I said, I think in keeping with a Texas tradition, that Adrian Favell is a maverick. Everybody in here knows what a maverick is. Not just a basketball player in Dallas, but someone who doesn't run with the herd or with the pack. And I said, whether you agree or disagree with him, his work is always interesting, pushing the boundaries of normal, quote-unquote, social science and expanding our knowledge of human mobility in all its dimension. This book brings together a collection of his most provocative essays, sure to be at the top of the reading list of every serious migration scholar. So let me welcome Adrian Favell to Texas. Will you please join me in
Well, thank you very much, Jim, for the kind words and organising this with Caroline. It's really a pleasure to finally make it to Dallas and SMU to talk a bit. And I'm going to talk, as Jim suggested, about this book. The book is a book of essays that happened a little bit by chance. I was approached by an editor at ECPR for a new series that they had of essays, and this has given me an opportunity to recycle lots of things that I've published over the years with updates now and kind of a bit of new reflection on them. And it's a way of trying to make sense, I think, of the various elements of research that I've done in different corners of migration studies and beyond in some ways. And the book will be available fairly soon. What I propose to do today is talk a bit about what might be thought as the key question or key underlying framework for a lot of the work that I've done, which is really the relationship between the American, sometimes US and sometimes North American, i.e. also Canadian, framework for thinking about immigration studies. And I'll assume that many of you will be familiar with standard ways of thinking about immigration in the US. And of course the inspiration that the very powerful US field of international migration studies, immigration studies, race and ethnicity and so forth has globally and has particularly on European research in this field. To bring that into view with talking about Europe, so talking first of all about the relationship of various North American inspired approaches to migration and international immigration. Then also to point out, where the difficulties lie in transposing Europe and America, and that's effectively where almost all my work has come out of it. I've benefited hugely from getting in touch with American literature in an early stage, incorporating it very much in my early work, and then having taught in the US and tried to bring European concerns and sensibilities to a comparative agenda. But I'm perhaps acutely aware always of the difficulties involved in this kind of comparative business. And I'm going to say something about that, and that will be a prelim to talking about how we might get beyond some of the obvious problems of a flat comparative framework in international migration studies, and that's both transatlantically and within Europe. So I'm interested in problematizing the whole issue of comparatism, and this will then lead me into what is in a sense my standard interpretation of European migration phenomena, which again is at the heart of the book, where I'll identify three different types of migrations and mobilities that I think we can think about in the European context, which take us beyond just thinking about immigration in a kind of standard way. Some of it's still relatively standard and still fits some of the standard paradigms, but a lot of what is happening in Europe actually challenges our categories and ways of thinking about migration more generally. There are specific reasons why, in a regional context, Europe is an interesting laboratory for some of these migrations and new mobilities and so on. And if I have time at the end, I'll get down towards talking a little bit about Britain as well at the end, and the puzzle of current British immigration politics, which you may be aware of or not. But I'll hopefully say something about this. It's a really quite peculiar thing that's going on in Britain in terms of immigration at the moment. So to get back to the start then, I came out of political philosophy, and political theory is the first of five intellectual paradigms that I think have had a very dramatic effect on our understanding of European migrations that effectively were transposed and transported across the Atlantic in order to bring new light on European cases. And in each of these cases, each of these five fields that were influencing European studies, what they enabled effectively was a new generation, a new emerging concern in studies that could get European studies out of the very nation-specific focus that much study had up until that point. I'll say a bit more about what that looks like in a moment. What the old way of doing things was in different countries and why it was particularly problematic. But around I think in the late 1980s, so before I started doing my PhD, across a number of fields, you get pioneers, I think, in American-based immigration, migration studies that start throwing up new ideas that then ultimately get taken across the Atlantic and inspire new kinds of thinking. So, and I'll have to obviously be very brief with all of these. You can just note them as we go through them, and we can talk about a bit more later. The first one I will just put out as a little bit from the side, political theory, political philosophy, coming out of the paradigm inspired by the theory of justice and John Rawls, debates that circle around John Rawls's political philosophy about liberals and communitarians, and the particular uses that can be made of the contrast between a kind of individualistic liberalism and various forms of liberalism that try to recognise groups and cultures as also the sources of claims within liberalism, and therefore the issue of pluralism in liberal democratic thought is a first kind of area that provides a lot of inspiration. Obviously, there were critics of Rawls as a kind of Kantian liberal. He was critiqued from a Hegelian point of view by Michael Sandel, still at a very abstract level. Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, was part of this kind of critique, and he very specifically started connecting these debates with issues of multiculturalism. And particular for me, a particular influence was the work of Will Kimlicka, who comes straight out of the Oxford political theory scene that's debating liberals and communitarians. And he was a Canadian philosopher inspired effectively by minority rights issues in Canada, multiculturalism in Canada and its relationship to immigration in a Canadian context, providing a very general philosophical framework for the recognition of group rights and the reconciliation of cultural pluralism with a kind of liberal democratic constitutional framework. And if you notice, well, liberalism, community and culture, the more abstract political philosophy book, followed by multicultural citizenship, which is really the core work actually by 95. So that's the first kind of set of inspirations, and this obviously provides immediate intellectual theoretical framework for talking about the dilemma of liberalism, dilemmas of pluralism, but a problem perhaps in transposing the particular concerns of a settler immigrant society, Canada also, which itself is quite distinct from the US on many issues in this area, because it doesn't have the same kind of race issues, it doesn't have anything like the same kind of population density or complexity in the way of American immigration politics. So this was very directly transposed into European context. That was the first inspiration. Second one, fairly obviously, with people like Jim in the room here, the comparative immigration citizenship type of framework. You might want to comment a bit on where this all came from, but Jim Holyfield, Gary Freeman, Rogers Brubaker, coming out of Sociology. Before them, I guess, people like Ari Zolberg and Michael Pure are also kind of important in establishing certain ways of thinking. So there's a mix of kind of comparative politics, comparative political economy, and cultural comparative historical sociology, really, which creates a new paradigm looking at really the question of immigration and citizenship.
Yeah.
For me, Brubaker's work was particularly important. Brubaker did a study of France and Germany in the early 1990s, tracing the historical origins of French and German differences. It's a nice comparative, classic kind of comparative study, opening up a whole new way of thinking about comparing European cases, but raising new problems about whether.
Just as a footnote, I've sat in the Harvard Faculty Club, and he read the chapters of my book, and I read chapters of his book. We did that over a period of months.
If you like, that very historically specifies what I'm kind of assuming was the case, that there was a kind of group of people, in a sense. And what's interesting at this point, there's really not that much comparative immigration studies. I mean, these are kind of pioneering works that start laying down new ideas, and the important point here is it's Americans, often Europeanists, looking at Europe, providing new theoretical tools coming out of mainstream American political science that will actually transform the way that European studies are done, because for the reasons I'll get into. European studies at this point don't really have this kind of comparative and theory-driven vision. Let's see what the best order is. 1, 2. At the same time, I think, again, keeping this as brief as I can without going into too many details, international migration theory starts to become developed on an international scale. I think the work of Doug Massey on the Mexican Migration Project and his subsequent attempt over a period of really, I think, from the late 80s to the late 90s to systematize a kind of global framework for migration theory as such, which in his work is very much about networks-driven explanation.
This is your third perspective.
This is the third perspective. So quite distinct. This is coming out of a mix of sociology and economics and demography, providing a new kind of framework for international comparative research.
Put Cortez in this category?
And I think, yes, along these, it's a little bit, I guess, Alejandro Cortez and the early work of Saskia Sassen is similarly a kind of economics-driven type of argument. In their case, it's kind of driven by a kind of sociology of economy, the migrant economy, and then the notion of ethnic economies. So I guess lying behind this, something like Michael Pure is sort of an earlier kind of inspiration. But basically, a kind of fairly mechanistic vision of migration that's made studying migration in relation to economics. Again, this is a whole set of works that open up new possibilities for Europeans. Then I think there's switching over to a different mode of thinking from anthropology. I think the literature on transnationalism, and we might talk about when this dates back to. I would have thought that one would say that Nina Glick-Schiller's early work and Nina Glick-Schiller and associates pioneering a new way of thinking about transnational migration, transmigrants, and breaking out of very place-specific anthropology and actually showing that communities and migrations could span continents. Again, work that's really centered or coming out of the American examples initially, but then creates a paradigm that gets picked up. Alejandro Cortez, along with his work on the kind of political economy sort of economic sociology side, also gets involved in the transnationalism debates. And by the late 1990s, you have a very lively transnationalism agenda spanning European cases, people like Steven Vertevek. But again, also the kind of one-way thing in many ways. Everyone starts by studying the US or thinking about the US and transposing theories and models from the US to Europe. And the fifth one, which I think has really seen its development only really in the last, since the 2000s, but it's really the comparative assimilation and integration research. Again, Alejandro Cortez provides part of this paradigm with his segmented assimilation type of work. He's recently started thinking about comparative international work. Very central, I think, Richard Alba and his attempt to create a paradigm really for thinking about assimilation that would also extend to European cases. And there's now a long list of ambitious comparative works involving people like Nancy Foner and Mary Waters. Critiqued from one side by my old my mentor and co-teacher at UCLA, Roger Waldinger, who's been sort of the one persistent kind of thorn in the side of this sort of American agenda to transpose the assimilation research from the US to Europe. So this is a kind of overview of what gets going, and what all of this provided in different ways, in different kinds of works, was a set of, as I said, theoretically driven, comparative models that could be used in the European case. And what really was deficient about European research, you go back to the 1980s and 1970s, was the fact that research in different European contexts was almost always very internally structured by very specific national concerns. And I was particularly concerned myself with the comparison between Britain and France. Britain and France, in a way, were the most advanced immigration countries in Europe in many ways. They were seen, in some sense, the countries that have gone the furthest in developing a kind of multi-ethnic society incorporating immigrants in the post-war period. But they're taken very different parts, as you would know. There's a British model and a French model, which is standardly juxtaposed. And without going into the details of the juxtaposition, what you can say is that each of those countries it threw up a literature in each of these countries that was completely internal in a sense. So it was a very sophisticated, complex, politically heated debate in both countries about their respective models, roughly speaking, race relations in Britain and republican citizenship and immigration in France, citoyenneté and intégration aussi in the French conception. And there was also a conception of integration in Britain that was different, structured by the race relations concerns going back. Both of them, interestingly, influenced by an American model, but in very different ways. The British had sort of imported a race relations perspective from the US, although it looks very different on the ground in British practice. The French had sort of imported a kind of American assimilationist type of model in a way. Or at least there's ways in which the French conceptions of citizenship and republicanism actually can be tracked back to American ideas of republican citizenship as well. But the debates were nationally specific. This is the point that I really want to make, is that they were a set of concepts, a set of ideas that were almost incompatible with one another. And when the French wanted to study Britain, or when the British wanted to study France in a comparative way, they always came up with the same answers. That was that they were different, obviously. There was no way we could compare them, really. And number two, our way of doing it is better, obviously, than the others. So the British would look at the French and say they're completely chauvinistic, universalistic, colonialist. How can they imagine their country, this idea of integration just is hiding a certain sort of French universalism. It's obviously ethnocentric and unable to deal with race and differences in ethnicity. And the French would look at the British and say, well, the British model is obviously just completely racist. They're obviously obsessed with racial differences, ethnicity. It's a pluralist multiculturalism that is just full of ethnic conflicts. There's no unifying idea of citizenship, and so they're both failing. And the reality was they were both actually, in the long run, historically, had built models that were relatively successful at creating multi-ethnic, multicultural societies. And I always wanted to resist the idea that Britain is multicultural and France is not, because it's not true. They're both multicultural, they're both multi-ethnic, they're both multiracial, and they both have very strong ideas of how the nation state integrates immigrants around Britishness and Frenchness in also cultural ways, as well as around philosophical notions of liberalism that both countries have. So this was the problem. So there's a problem of comparativism. It was impossible to get the two to talk together. When there were conferences in the 1980s, French and British academics had literally started shouting at each other, basically. Complete misunderstandings, and
French would call it a dialogue des sourds.
Yeah, it's a dialogue des sourds, exactly. And this was the kind of problematic that I had to try and create a comparative literature, a comparative approach. And what I did, therefore, was turn to the American literatures.
For those of you who don't speak French, that's the French for dialogue of the deaf.
So the American literature, in other words, particularly I think initially for me, Brubaker and Kimlicka, so North American literature, there's a mix of American comparativists in Europe plus Canadian political theory, provided the key to really sort of rethinking all of this. This was the philosophies of integration, etc., which you can is a part of this book of essays. I should say, what's interesting about the British, the European ways of doing it is, of course, that there's good reasons why academic production in Britain and France is heavily structured by these kind of normative, nation-specific kinds of concerns, and that's because British and French academics are much closer to policy and politics than academics in America, generally speaking. Academics in America, in political science, sociology, even economics, even demographic studies, with some exceptions, obviously, but not that many, tend to do their scientific work in a kind of splendid isolation from the dirty business of everyday politics. That is, there is an autonomous, to put this in a positive way, an autonomous realm of social science that has a relationship, of course, in some sense to the way society deals with these issues and hopefully influences it in a certain way, but there is a kind of sense in which American academia is insulated from the political process. Not to say that people aren't themselves politicized around democratic and republican politics and so on, but the research itself tends to have this kind of disciplinary autonomy. Whereas in Europe this is almost impossible to find. I mean, it's in this kind of area of applied social science, everybody is very closely tied up with the policy process in many ways. There's a certain amount of autonomous academic production, but production is so specifically structured by the funding of research and through the specific national agenda. So in Britain it was a heated agenda about race relations, racial inequality, and then the breakup of the race relations paradigm as new issues emerged to do with Islam, Asian identity, and then new kinds of migrations, as we're going to hear. That drove the debate and drove the academic discussion.
So you don't have the pretense of value-free social sciences.
Yeah, so it's both. Yeah, it's both a problem and also a resource, in the sense that I think academics are also much closer. And the smaller the country, the more close they are, in effect. Because I say this in my essay for the book, the migration theory book. If you're in Denmark, you're always on the phone answering calls from the newspapers, because you're kind of implicitly in the part of the policy process, as well as the basic fact that the research is hugely structured by funding, and this has either been national funding or increasingly European funding as a better kind of comparative framework for migration gets going. It's Europe effectively that creates the kind of comparative framework. So, and I'm interested in Bourdieu's work in this context, just the specific notion of the relationship of notions of autonomy and heteronomy in research, and that is the relationship of scientific research. The power of science, does it lie in its disciplinary autonomy from outside political and ethical pressures, or does it lie in its ability to intervene surgically, I guess, in this area? So in European migration research, I think that there was a real sense that the agenda of the American and North American theoretical models and comparative examples really provided a tool, a key to get beyond this kind of comparativism. And you can look into then a whole series of works, I think, they get going, both written by American Europeanists and increasingly by European scholars that start thinking comparatively. I just want to mention there were two kinds of exceptions, I think, particularly in getting beyond the British race relations perspective, which was very difficult to transpose to continental Europe. So two writers that were writing in English that I think did provide an early inspiration for what comes to develop as a distinctive field of migration studies, distinct from the study of race and ethnicity, which is the kind of dominant form in Britain up to this point in English language studies. Race and ethnicity has continued, and the issues of culture, race and ethnicity can still be pursued, of course, in all kinds of ways, and they intersect in interesting ways with the question of immigration. But there was an emergence, I think, of a distinctive migration research paradigm. Really two names, I think, stand out in the development. One of them is Stephen Castles, who already in the 1970s was doing Marxist global political economy type studies, very close in a way to your work, or to or to Portes and Sassen's earlier type of work.
I think that was the first book I ever read on this subject. Was Castles and Cossack, Immigrants and Class Structure.
Yeah. Me too.
Yeah, so 1973.
And then Manuel Castells.
So it's a kind of Marxist perspective that really looks at labour markets and kind of the politics of immigration around the new migrants and how they're fitting into industrial class structures. And the other I think name that's worth noting in this respect, it kind of emerges more centrally, I think, for people working in sociology and politics much later, because it's happening in geography, is the work of Russell King at the University of Sussex, where I subsequently go to work. And I get thrown in with some geographers and discover that there's this whole paradigm of migration studies that geographers are using that isn't bound at all by the the problem of political science and sociology models tends to come down to, I mean, one, it's the overwhelming focus always on policies and politics and institutions and law, the kind of top-down nature of migration studies that you get out of these disciplines. And the other one, I think, is the fact that it's locked into this model of citizenship, of immigration and citizenship, which is a model, a kind of implicitly sociological model about the progress of a migrant through stages of settlement towards full citizenship, effectively through race relations and through ethnic conflicts to a kind of recognition of full citizenship, which is, again, it has this normative kind of perspective. That's I would say Stephen Castles has always embraced that particular model. So, whereas the migration studies coming out of geography with Russell King and so forth really don't focus at all on the state or conceptions of citizenship. They're interested in the pure phenomenon of movement, the movement across borders, and how internal migration and international migration, rather than being two different worlds, are on a kind of continuum. And it also opens up a notion of mobilities, which I think is going to become very important. There's the notion that international migration is only one very narrow form of population movement across space and across borders, and that we need to look at international migration on a continuum with all kinds of other forms of both migrations. What we call immigration, for example, is a kind of narrow subset, in other words, of population movements as a whole. I hope to explain this a little bit more as we go along. So that's given you a lot of names and a sort of overview of where the field lay. And my own, as I said, my own kind of take on all of this was, first of all, that there was both inspiration to be taken from the transatlantic agenda, but also there was a certain amount of caution as well, in the sense that I always wanted to say that it wasn't necessarily going to be easy to transpose American concerns about immigration to Europe. One is to do with the scale of societies. The typical error that's made is to compare the US with France, or the US with a small European country, and expect it to behave in the same way, in some sense. I mean, we can expect immigration to take the same kind of pattern as implicitly the American model. But in fact, it's problematized, obviously, not only by the rather peculiar national cultural specificities of a lot of European cases, but also by the sheer differences in scale, and often the differences in types of migrants and the specificities of European histories and the migrants that they've had vis-a-vis the American immigration history. And I suppose a core issue for European comparisons with America is that European nations are they've had a hard time historically recognising themselves as countries of immigration, effectively. So it makes all the difference that in the US, effectively, it is part of its self-understanding and self-identity as a country of immigration. Whereas, where in almost all of the European cases, although migration has always been a big part of the history, it's really a recent development and also kind of political struggle, in a sense, to try and make the discovery.
Yeah, we actually, some of you were here when we presented, P. Arrhenius and I presented the Control of Immigration. A few of you actually bought that book. And if you look at that book, that's exactly the distinction we make between nations of immigrants versus countries of immigration.
Yeah. So you can immediately see, if you did a flattening comparison of the US and Europe, and I've somewhat rudely accuse Richard Alber of doing this occasionally, but you're not capturing something that's important about the European case, and it lies both in the specific national histories, but also the nature of types of migrants and the way in which migration issues have been, as it were, internally constructed conceptually. And this is where I also think that comparative research, that is, research that uses straight comparisons of institutions, laws, policies, politics, political dynamics, and so on, which we have the general models of political science, sociology, anthropology in its own way, and economics and so forth, really need to be combined somehow with a sense of comparatism in the contextual context of different European nation states. And the comparatism, I mean by this a kind of interpretive comparatism, but you're also alive to linguistic differences, the meanings of words and concepts, constructions of race, culture, ethnicity, types of migrants, and so on as part of this. And sensitizing, initially I was obviously obsessed with the differences of the British ways of talking about these questions and the French ways, and how they could actually be brought together. Both of these problems, I think, lead to this other issue that we can just put on the table and maybe get back to, but the ways in which standard ways of doing comparative research, but also standard ways sometimes of falling back into very nationally specific ways of doing research, that is both the technical apparatus of research and obvious kinds of problems with cross-cultural understanding, tend to reinforce this problem of methodological nationalism that is always there. And it's particularly problematic when we're talking about universal conceptions of citizenship tied to states and state-centered views of the world, which then effectively take the nation-state society as the unit always.
If I could just interject there for 1 minute, I mean,
we
as a political scientist, looking at immigration studies in the United States, the big problem always was that this is very dominated by sociology. So it was all very society-centric, society-driven. So, Adrian and Caroline know I wrote a chapter on the politics of migration when I said, we need to bring the state back into the analysis, not take it out. So, this is, a point of discussion, if you will, between some of the work I've done and what he's talking about here. How central should the state be to talking about migration?
I mean, in some ways, I think the comparative institutionalist type of work that Jim helped develop, and which I think was contributed to by many of the names that I mentioned earlier, and the establishing of this paradigm of immigration and citizenship, I might argue that it's going to take things too far the other way. The state became everything became institutional in a sense, but there's good reasons why the state was needed at a certain point, of course, in the discussion. So these kind of preliminary, this kind of framing of the problematics and so forth leads me to looking at European migrations in a different kind of way, I guess, trying to break up European migration examples across the continent in a way that allows us to identify somewhat different kinds of types of migration and different kinds of typologies, in a sense, that may differ from a standard sort of model. So the standard model of immigration, as I've hinted, is this model of a kind of linear kind of process in which immigrants arrive in a country, they cross the border, and from that point on, really, we lose sight of the sending context quite often. Sending context gradually gets transformed into ethnicity, effectively, and an ethnicity that's constructed on the inside of the country as a kind of staging point towards a full settlement. So the immigrant who moves to a country goes through maybe stages of legal settlement in order to get permanent residency and move towards full citizenship, and then a combination of legal and political and ultimately sociological processes that lead to the full settlement of the immigrant and their eventual recognition as a full and complete citizen of that country. This is the standard story that we have. Along the way, possibly shaped by more or less coercive or demanding conceptions of national culture. So in the American context, there's always been a sense that becoming an American was a relatively light issue in terms of substantive culture. That is, you're allowed to keep all kinds of cultural differences, but becoming an American was more a kind of an adoption of a way of life and a set of values, a set of ethics. Of course, when patriotism comes to the fore, we get a clearer idea of what it means to be an American, and that there may be some cultural content in that. But the American model was a sort of somewhat abstract model of citizenship that enabled all comers to become American. We were used to the fact in the European context, such as France or Britain, there was a stronger kind of cultural content sometimes to the becoming French or becoming British, but there was a similar kind of linear process. And this, I think, more or less works up until the 1970s for European immigrations. It's in the European case, the migrations are very colonially specific. That is, there are particular groups coming from places that have special connections with the European receiving state. Migrants have been partly socialised already into becoming French or British, partly through these colonial relations. They're coming into an industrial context still, where they're going to be workers in an industrial economy that is presumably going to integrate them through labour. There's a kind of limited but specific recognition of certain sorts of racial and ethnic differences that enable the process to take place. And Britain and France are early in this, in the sense that they fairly early on go through a lot of political conflict that forces each nation to sort of come to terms with the fact that the future is going to be diverse in some sense. It's going to be ethnically diverse and racially diverse, and they need to find new ways of conceptualizing the nation that's more inclusive, it's not culturally exclusive. And of course there's always an anti-immigrant right wing usually that is looking for an older vision of Britain or France against the kind of new multi-ethnic vision. But in both cases, a lot can be said that Britain and France go a long way already in the 60s and 70s towards to these things. The 1970s, as you will probably know, the familiar story, there's a stop to migration, there's an economic crisis that stops the primary flow, and that actually gives an opportunity for migrants to start going through this more marked settlement process. We get a differentiation, there's more family reunification, and then most migration becomes asylum seeking. But what we then find in the 1980s and 90s, and this is where the new vision in a sense comes into this, is that we get a new kind of diversification and differentiation of migration that actually starts to break apart this classic model of immigration, settlement, citizenship. Already, I think the 80s and very much more markedly in the 90s and 2000s, linked to globalization and linked to the shift, obviously, to post-industrial economy. Britain, France, and many other European countries start to get a much wider range of migrants. They can no longer count on the colonial relations to do the kind of business of integration. They can no longer limit the conception of immigration, say in Britain, to West Indians or South Asians. But they start to have to recognise that there's a much wider range of diversity of sending countries, new kinds of migration systems, and often migration relations that have no relation at all to the historical colonial relations. New countries across Europe become receiving states. So for the first time, first of all, the asylum receiving states start to realise that they're actually receiving primary labour migrants effectively through asylum. So the Scandinavian cases, Germany is kind of has received a lot of asylum seekers, as well as guest workers.
It'll go on.
Having to recognise a different kind of scenario, and particularly southern European countries start to be countries of immigration. So new kinds of migration systems is something obviously can be looked at in all kinds of ways. You look at, say, particular African systems of migration, or Chinese, which is a new example, classic example of new migration. I think under-recognised kind of migration systems, actually very large, into Europe as a result of globalisation. there's the polarization of the economy, new kinds of service sector jobs, and new kinds of 3D jobs, the dirty, dangerous, and dull jobs coming into the economy, which create the demand for migrants again. But also with globalization, we get a diversification across the categories of migrants. So as well as it were, the standard low-end labour migration model, you get a much larger range of middling type of migrations. And we often easily recognise elite migration as part of globalisation, free-floating elites, but a lot of the migrants that maybe we think of as elites are not really elites at all. They're in the middle. They're they're students, people who are coming through education channels. There are categories like nurses and engineers that become migrants, often channeled in through different sorts of legal possibilities with service sectors and so forth. So they're not often recognised as immigration as such. A general kind of diversification across the stratum of migrants, as well as mobility more generally becomes a more widespread phenomenon. So a lot more people can get on aeroplanes and afford to travel. A lot of them are turning into something like migrants through their travel, although the travel and mobility is often ambiguous in relation to a typical idea of immigration, not a back and forth. And somewhere along the line, it starts to shade into things like tourism and commuting, or retiring, for example, retiring abroad. These sorts of things all ought to be within migration studies in a sense, but they're not what we think of when we think of immigrants.
Would you put circular migration in this category?
Yeah. So circular migration, I think, is also something facilitated by these possibilities, and it's particularly facilitated in Europe, as I'll say in a second. So all of these things, what I tried to in the introductory chapter of this book is identify then the three primary types of migration that really emerge on the European landscape in the 1990s and 2000s that we need to relate to the old sort of standard model of immigration and the immigrant in a way that is still there but is being differentiated in various ways. Now the first one obviously is what has happened to the classic immigrant in Europe. I've already said that it's been diversified, migration systems have become more complicated, they've become a lot more transnational, there is a lot more back and forth in the same way as there is in the US, say with Mexican migration. It's no longer a simple one-way linear from sending country to receiving country, from immigrant to citizen. It's often complicated by other aspects. This kind of migration, which we might very crudely call quote-unquote ethnic migration, that is non-European migration that is still seen as ethnically distinct and to some extent is driven by the old immigration models, still remains a very nation-centred kind of issue. And while in the 1990s a lot of transnationalism starts to get recognised, and we see all kinds of emerging migration systems and back and forth, particularly I think for migrants that are closer to the regional part of Europe. So Turkish migration, Moroccan migration, for example, is the most obvious place to look for transnationalism amongst what might be thought of as more classic immigrant groups. On the other hand, after the 1990s particularly, there is a return, I think, to a much more nation-centred kind of way of dealing with these issues. And this is where integration has become the all-pervasive dominant framework. And now everybody in Europe is talking about integration, a little bit in the way that the French used to talk about it, and the way the British also tried to sometimes talk about integration alongside multiculturalism. Integration becomes recognised as the key concept. And I've spent a lot of time in my work over the years critiquing the concept of integration and trying to show how integration is the classic nation-centred, nation-state-centred form of thinking about immigration, because it is necessarily connected to a kind of model of the nation-state as an organic whole that is somehow remaking itself, reintegrating these difficult, marginal, problematic populations by finding cultural or political or
So you were not happy with Angela Merkel's comment that multiculturalism is dead?
Yeah, so everybody says now multiculturalism, this is the political rhetoric. Of course, multiculturalism isn't dead in Europe. Every country in Europe is multicultural.
Yeah.
It's just that the policies have become unfashionable for various reasons. And integration. But what's interesting about integration is that nobody knows, of course, nobody knows how integrated any of these societies are to begin with. Let's leave aside the immigrants, but French society, is it integrated or not? Is it 50% integrated or 70% integrated? Or is it a bunch of individuals living in a modern society with their differences and complexities being held together by a rather limited conception of national unity to paper over the fact that we're all individuals living in modern society? And particularly at the higher end of society, nobody really bothers whether rich people are integrated, or because even though you think they might be the model would suggest that they would be the most integrated, that they're the least problematic, and yet at many levels of society, and I would argue we're quite long way down society, modern individualism allows people to kind of feel integrated in a kind of a la carte way. You can be integrated one day because you feel patriotic. The next day you're a selfish individualist who's just flying around the world and doesn't really want to bother about,
Well, it's odd that this French economist Thomas Piketty seems to have captured the zeitgeist in his book.
So basically the concept of integration isn't what it was. It isn't what it was in the 19th century. There are no unified organic nations anymore. Rather, there are nations that are problematized by globalization and by all kinds of international processes, such as the economy and global culture. But integration gets imposed on the most vulnerable populations. Effectively, the only group in our society has to prove that they're integrated now are immigrants. This is what has happened all around Europe. Is that immigrants have been, in order to access the rights that they should have as citizens or long-term settlers in these societies, they have to prove that they're integrated. And nowadays in many European countries you literally have to prove you're integrated by passing an exam. You have to show you can speak the language, you have to show you have a clean criminal record and can come up with the right moral answers when people ask you whether it's a good thing to in terms of issues to do with gender relations or treating children and so forth, and certain things that have led to issues with Islam in Europe. You certainly have to show that you're morally and politically committed, you're living in. And there are literally integration tests. Some of these tests even have things like, you have to have lots of arcane knowledge about where the Queen was born, or how many kings were called William, and this kind of thing. It's stuff that we ordinary people don't actually know. So yes, the nation is still central to immigration and integration, but it's a peculiar kind of symbolic. I'd argue a symbolic sort of set of actions that are forcing these issues onto immigrants. A second group within Europe is, I think, is very specific to the European context, and which is a completely different kind of migration, is the internal European migration that I study in some of my later work. The people I call Eurostars. The Eurostars are a product of what's particular about the European region, in that the European region has, as part of its economic integration, created the possibilities for all kinds of free movement across borders of citizens of each of the European member states. So we're not really these are not immigrants as we'd normally conceive of them. They're people from other European countries, and it's worth distinguishing for a while West Europe, that is older EU members, from the Eastern Europeans, who I'll mention in a moment, if only that there's still an important sociological distinction to be drawn, not a legal or political
He's
distinction.
not paraphrasing Donald Rumsfeld there, by the way.
No.
For old versus new Europe.
No, so the old Europe, the Eurostars from Western Europe, they're not your typical immigrants, in other words, and we might easily forget them in immigration studies because we just think of them as a bunch of elites, young French people going to Britain, or young Spanish people moving north in the current economic climes. Over the years, I've done various studies on the free moving population in Europe, and without going into too much detail about what happens to them, I think it becomes very interesting as a kind of laboratory of a certain sort of post-national experiment in in a way, a kind of post-national society. I mean, the premise here, effectively, is that we have a European economic space. People can move across it, and you can live. You go to work, live, study, settle, ultimately retire in one of the other European countries, and you're absolutely free to do it. There are no visas involved. You can cross the border whenever you like, and aside a few kind of technical requirements, it's a very easy thing to do. It also has accrued to families and children of people that move. So it's not only a worker migration, and it has created a new kind of incipient form of European citizenship, although it's a long way short of the old kind of thick citizenship that we thought immigrants would move towards. This is obviously a form of transnationalism, potentially a kind of form of post-national society within Europe. But in relation to migration studies, it throws up all kinds of interesting conceptual issues about how do we relate these kind of migrants to immigrants. One of the things I try to argue in the work on them is that in fact we find that despite the fact that all the legal and political barriers are down, the experiences of these migrants actually, over time, does resemble in some sense the pressures that are faced by all kinds of immigrants, in the sense that his settlement is not necessarily that much easier just because you're middle class and educated. You also experience certain sorts of ethnic differences, even if it's only the ethnicity of being a German living in Amsterdam, where you're kind of constantly reminded that you're German all the time by the Dutch. However much you kind of try to become a member of the local society, you're always kind of facing certain sorts of barriers. But also it's showing up very clearly the limits to the open economic scenario. Now, without labouring too much on the West European experience, which is very particular, where this gets interesting, particularly for migration and immigration, is that after 2004 and 2007, these free movement rights are extended to all of the new East European members in Europe. And so we get a whole new category of migrants. These are people, in a way, in the past we might have thought of them as immigrants. We would have thought of low, relatively low class-based or low, lesser skilled worker migrants coming from poorer countries in the peripheries of Europe to the rich northwestern Europe as immigrants who might go through an immigrant experience, albeit that they were white and they were Christian. Nevertheless, there might be ways in which their experiences would be thought to be similar to Turks or Moroccans or perhaps Africans or Chinese in a European context. But legally and politically, after 2004, 2007, all of the EU member states, the new member states, the populations that are moving from these countries to Western Europe are no longer immigrants, effectively. They are free movers, like the Eurostars. They are, on paper at least, a new kind of migrant. And this is a particularly important situation because there was never very much West European internal migration, but obviously after 2000 and 2004 we've seen a much more dramatic kind of migration within Europe, coming from former East and Central European states that are now member states, particularly Poland, but also large numbers from the Baltic states, and then after 2007 Romania and Bulgaria also joined these possibilities. They all, in different countries, they face potentially transitional barriers, so not all of the doors were open immediately for all of these migrants. But this was a kind of new geopolitical situation, a kind of return to Europe in some sense, and a return to a kind of a more mobile Europe that actually pre-existed the Cold War, certainly, which was a huge exercise in constraining population movements, the Iron Curtain and so on. But going back to the 19th century, a much more fluid Europe where there was a lot more cross-border mobilities of all kinds. A regional Europe in which obviously there's an economic integration of the labour market, and also an interesting sense in which the labour markets of Western Europe, and particularly the demographics of many countries in Western Europe, also were producing a demand for east-westward movement from the east. The new kinds of migrants that move from east to west, yes, they are lower-end migrants to some extent, but in many cases they're also highly educated. There's a kind of hidden part of East European migration that's actually very highly skilled, highly educated. They've also become Eurostars, in a sense, in the West European context. But they are certainly a lot of, and in many cases, very highly skilled workers. That is, they're workers coming over and moving into skilled sectors, usually plumbing, home construction, domestic types of work. In many ways related, you could relate this to the sort of Mexican migration in the US as well. It's a movement of driven by demand, but often moving downwards into this new service economy where there's this kind of low wage type work at the bottom. Now, what's interesting about all of this is that Britain, which you might not think of as the most enthusiastic immigration country, which actually is the one that's the most dramatically transformed by these migrations in the 1990s and 2000s. Not only actually by the now very visible East European migrations in Europe, but already with the West European migrations, London, for example, during the 1990s and 2000s, became the most popular European destination, really, for internal European migration. And it was a particular kind of internal European migration of the highly skilled, highly ambitious, highly talented young European population that moved to London looking really for career reasons, and moving to what was seen as the most dynamic and most open economy in the continent. This was particularly the case, ironically, really, in relation to France, where the French basically lost an entire generation of its most skilled and educated workforce, who all just simply moved to London. There was a kind of massive exodus of young French people moving into the British economy, simply because London was seen as a much more dynamic, open place to go and work. And if you're working in media or IT or university work, the British university system is now the most cosmopolitan university system anywhere in the world, I should think, because it's been so open to skilled migration. Finance, obviously, with the British, with London as the capital of Europe financially, in reality, if not obviously where the bank is centred. For many kinds of reasons, Britain, and London particularly, becomes the destination point. And without again going into this into details, we might talk later this week, the British economy benefits massively from these migrations, because there's a selection effect here that is extremely impressive. And while countries like France are kind of going through this long drawn-out torpor economically, wondering why this is, because a lot of their young people basically can't get into jobs at all. There's a kind of stagnant entry level for young people. You could move to Britain, or you could move to Ireland as well, which is another example, and move into work very quickly. And also, these economies happen to be very open to foreigners. They also seem to practice non-discrimination in the way that the European Union likes non-discrimination to take place. That is, you're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of nationality when you have a job. That's European law. All countries are subject to this within the EU. In actual case, although Britain is very unenthusiastic about Europe in many ways, it's the country that's where you're most likely to be treated as a European when you apply for a job, and not be excluded in favour of a British person. Because and a lot of employers in Britain recognised that they were getting some of the most highly talented, well-educated people around, and this was, for all kinds of reasons, a very kind of beneficial migration. Now, what was interesting, of course, was that the same thing immediately happened with the Poles and East Europeans in the post-2004 period. And Britain, along with Ireland and Sweden, curiously, was the only country initially to open the doors without any kind of restrictions on Polish and other migration. And so a very large number of Poles immediately moved to Britain, at least 500,000 Poles, but that's only the kind of obvious registered part of the population. And this also has a transformative effect on the economy, in that you see in Britain all kinds of parts of the service sector industries and these kind of skilled work. I mentioned plumbing earlier. The Polish plumber is the case, of course, in point, are completely taken over by East Europeans. There are no British plumbers anymore. Okay, they've gone. Just as there are no, just as in parts of the US, of course, these sectors are entirely controlled by Mexican entrepreneurs and businesses and so forth. So it's a circular migration. There's a lot of entrepreneurship, a lot of people flying back and forth, and an interesting kind of open and fluid sort of scenario. Now, the issue here, of course, is this free movement? Is this are Poles and other East Europeans and potentially Bulgarians and Romanians and others, new member states, becoming Eurostars, or is there still some sort of sense in which they're immigrants in these societies? And this is where, again, quite a bit of research I've done is focused on whether there are still residual sociological barriers to these kinds of migrants, beyond the official legal and political recognition of their rights. And the perhaps unsurprising answer is that yes, there still is. It still matters if you're East European as opposed to West European. There is still ethnicity at work. It's not only a class-based ethnicity. There is obviously a sense in which this is a worker population being channeled into lesser prestigious positions in society, but it also applies to some extent to higher skilled workers. And it's also very differentiated across European societies. So there is somewhat different things to be said about Britain vis-a-vis Italy or Spain on these sorts of questions. But there is also there's both a exclusionary dynamic, that is a kind of continued sense of sociological exclusion based on ethnic and cultural differences that see these migrants as somehow inferior to free movers, even though they should not really be seen as kind of immigrants in the old sense. There's a certain sort of suspicion around them as well, because they seem to be too much free moving in a sense. The fact that they're able to come back and forth on cheap airlines. I have this nice slide sometimes for these talks where it shows you all of the new airports in Poland that service British airports. There's about 20 different airports in Poland that have cheap airlines flying back and forth. They don't seem to be terribly concerned about becoming British, because they're European citizens and they can kind of fly back and forth, and they seem to have this rather flexible attitude about their status in Britain that's not the kind of commitment that's normally required with this kind of idea of integration. But they are very instrumental in their relations with the British economy and British society, so that's another part of it. And then there is also this sort of continued sense in which the polarised economy is also pushing people who are highly skilled or much better skilled than they are in terms of the work they do into low-end exploitative type work. And this is part of the story. And this is really where I kind of get to the final couple of points that I wanted to make about where Britain is now in all of this. Well, there was a nice story blew up last week. British newspapers, if you ever go look at them, are full of hysterical stories continually about immigration and migrants who are ruining everything, taking everything, stealing everything. Currently, it's a kind of hysterical period at the moment in British politics.
We wouldn't know anything about this in Texas.
As we move towards a vote potentially in the next couple of years about British membership in the European Union, and it's really all bound up with that. So the story this week was a company in Northampton, an Irish company, and this is interesting because it's free movement of right of establishment, and the Irish have been very entrepreneurial in allowing all kinds of free movement possibilities in their economy until it crashed in 2008. In the British economy, which has weathered, actually I should have said, that weathered the 2008 storm a little better in some ways than some of the continental European economies, the Irish setting up this sandwich making factory in Northampton, the centre of Britain, and basically saying that they couldn't find any British workers to work there. They couldn't get anybody to work on the minimum wage. So there is a minimum wage, and there is some sort of labour law still in Britain. It's not completely Wild West capitalism, but But the jobs were not particularly attractive to British workers, but they were finding a lot of success in recruiting Hungarians coming over and earning twice the, supposedly twice what they could get at home. And this, of course, has blown up as a huge scandal. And it's the typical kind of scandal that we're getting in British politics at the moment, that is scandalised by these European migrations. So, first of all, it's a focus on East Europeans, on white, Christian, hard-working, sometimes quite skilled, and certainly dynamic migrant populations, not the classic immigrants. It's not an issue about race and ethnicity. It's not an issue about Islam, which is still a raging issue in Britain, but not. This is not what's motivating the current anti-immigration politics in Europe, in Britain. It's something else. It's a focus on European migrants as the problem, effectively, not classic immigrants. And as you may know, a new party of the last few years, the United Kingdom Independence Party, has risen to challenge the Conservative Party, obviously with its one agenda, which is to bring Britain out of Europe. That's the agenda of the UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party. But their number one topic is immigration. But it's not immigration of the old kind. It's not those immigrants that we'd think of as classically non-European, ethnically different, where issues of racial conflict, problems of integration culturally and ethically, the kinds of classic immigration questions that we're familiar with over the decades, but specifically European migrants who are the problem. It's the Polish migrant who comes over, who seems to fly back and forth, but is also maybe keen on bringing their wife and children over and getting access to Britain's wonderful health service and education service, neither of which are actually wonderful. But in any case, there seems to be this sort of possibility with free movement. And this is a debate that's raging in Britain now. This is the new politics of immigration, or new politics of, I don't know what we call it, the new politics of free movement or mobility. It's xenophobic, but it's not classic anti-immigration. But it is anti-European. And why this is interesting, I think, is that obviously from what I've said before, Britain in many ways is the country that's most fulfilled the idea of a free-moving, mobile, in other words, integrated, in the European sense of the word, integrated European economy in terms of its labour market. I should also say that the British are also amongst the most enthusiastic of using their EU rights to do things like buy houses in the south of France or retire in Italy, all of which is going to become very difficult when they pull out. And people like me are also going to be in a lot of trouble since I live in Britain part of the time and work in France. And
it was dangerous.
Back and forth. So the free movement population, which includes Britons who seem to like Europe when it's all about retiring in the south of Europe, or shopping for cheap wine, but don't like it, or indeed enjoying good Italian food when they go to a restaurant in London, but don't like it when it means open access of free moving Europeans. Although up to a point they were very enthusiastic about this as well, in the sense that again the British record on non-discrimination on the labour market is, I think, very good. So it's an interesting kind of situation, which I was talking with Hiroki earlier, in which the economic dynamics of this are absolutely different to the political dynamics. That is, there's an almost hysterical anti-immigration debate in the face of what on the face of it looks like 20 years of a huge success story, with Britain positioning itself as a kind of new United States offshore from Europe, in which not only the high skilled all move to Britain, but also they get all of the kind of dynamic service sector migration as well that transforms the economy. That is, I think, more or less the story. There's debate, of course, in Britain about to what extent any of these migrants are a cost to the welfare state, whether or not, as things get more tough, of course, the families are more likely to settle. That's what families do when they can no longer move back and forth in an easy way. The migration is likely to become permanent, which is a classic transnational dilemma, as it were, for migrants. and the politics are obviously going to harden as we move into an election period, which may see Britain pulling out of the European Union. So the bottom line of all of this is what on earth might happen when Britain moves out, if it moves out of the European Union, in relation to these very large numbers of foreigners who are living there now, who are not British citizens, who are not British permanent residents either, because they're Europeans that live there freely on EU citizenship rights.
Yeah, and Cameron has made a commitment to roll back some of the freedom.
What happens to all of these? They're already facing, in some cases, East Europeans face restrictions getting access to benefits and potential barriers to work. But what's interesting about European free movement is that none of the usual restrictions apply. So there are no quotas, there are no visas. There's nothing like what it is like if you're a European and want to move to America, of course. Just like everybody else, you face a very restrictive regime where you can only come as a visitor. You can't work, and if you want to work, you have to go through the usual immigration processes to get visa categories and get on the road to permanent residency and so forth. Is Britain going to bring in all of that for all of the European populations, and how will it deal with the large numbers of Europeans who are already working there? An interesting question. So maybe I'll leave that. I've kind of thrown out all kinds of different things.
Well, I only have about 1,000 questions. I don't know about the rest of the people in the room, but I'm going to stand up so that we can actually do this. But first of all, let's give him a hand for what I would describe as use two good French words, a tour d'horizon and a tour de force at the same time. So I know there are lots and lots of questions. So let's, and if anybody wants more coffee or some of the sweets back there, fill up, get ready. Feel free to get up.
Maybe, if there's, I've been very fast over a lot of things. Would you like me to clarify any points that you asked me? Well, basic questions.
Sandy Thatcher, our research associate, has his hand up, so we'll start with Sandy. Sandy.
In your review of the theories at the outset, I didn't hear you mention one that it seems to me it might be relevant, but I'm not clear about whether it actually has become involved with migration studies, and that's path dependency theory. And one might think it would be relevant, say, in explaining the influence of the colonial roots of European immigration. It might apply to the case, for instance, of Japan, with a homogeneous culture, explaining how immigration works out in that context and so forth. So I'm just curious to know whether any of the exponents of that theory have actually worked on immigration issues and brought the theory to bear.
So I would see this as related to the whole agenda of new institutionalism, effectively, and there are obviously different versions of the path dependency type of argument. One of which, in some sense, Roger Brubaker's is a kind of path-dependent argument. I don't think he quite uses this terminology in the sense that it's about cultural history, kind of legacy of models or legacy of past ways of dealing with this in law and culture. But there's also, I think, the possibility of looking more in terms of the kind of more economics-driven path dependency type. So the Doug North. So that kind of institutionalism. That was actually something that informed my work for Philosophy of Integration. I tried to distinguish a little bit between the argument about cultural, historical, sort of political, cultural explanations of the kind that Brubaker was providing, and a slightly more mechanistic sense of path dependency, in which path dependency was this the sense that certain policy solutions emerge at certain points in time to particular problems, and then they kind of get stuck there over the next decades. And this is precisely what the problem with race relations was. It was a very, in many ways, an intelligent response in the there was a crisis in British politics in the late 1960s, Enoch Powell and so forth, and you get a response across the political spectrum, a kind of new consensus that involves both the Conservative and Labour Party to come up with a new framework for integration and the ideas that it actually creates, are the ideas about race relations, but very specific to the British case, and the race relations framework is something that is a rather conservative philosophy in many ways, because it's sort of driven by concerns about social order and the dangers of a very strong white backlash against migrants, coupled with new sorts of progressive ideas about rights for migrants and ethnic recognition.
I think one of the good examples of this would probably be Randall Hansen's book on Britain.
Yeah, so
he consciously takes.
Randall also uses he also kind of uses the Neo Institute, and that was kind of in the air at the time, and I think there were these examples of people that were using the institutionalist argument. That's become, I think, subsequently very well established.
Yeah, when he presented his dissertation at Oxford, I was involved in this. The race relations people rejected it.
Yeah.
He had to go back and rewrite it.
Yeah, and the problem was that the race relations framework was a very positive framework in many senses for anti-discrimination, but it was not very sensitive to, first of all, the emergence of Islam as a kind of particular issue. So the recognition of Asian identities, which were not really race related in the same way as the West Indian issues. It wasn't the same kind of black and white issue, it was a different kind of issue. And then particularly as Islam gets emerged, it's a kind of cultural question. That was never covered by anti-discrimination, so that began to become, this is the whole work of Tariq Madood in Britain, recognising this. And then subsequently the new migrations, of which ultimately we get new Polish migrations and so forth, also difficult to fit in the race and ethnicity kind of models. And so there's been a breakup of that, and then the whole thing gets dissolved. But there was path dependency for a long period, which was creating these kinds of new debates and new issues that were problematic.
I always remember the comment by Stanley Hoffman, who taught at Harvard government, when they came up with this radical idea of path dependency, and Stanley said, "Oh, that's what we used to call history, right?"
Right.
So it's a fancy word for saying you're stuck in a historical track here. More questions, Faith?
Yeah, hi. I'm wondering, thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering, in your discussion of new migration and these new globalized flows, you don't at all discuss forced migration. Could you situate that into your discussion a little bit?
I mentioned very briefly asylum seeking, which apart from family reunification, after the kind of migration stop in the 1970s in the West European economies, the continuing flows of migration were either family reunification, which was driven by kind of human rights and recognition of families' ability to live together, and then asylum seeking, because there was still very strong refugee rights recognition in many continental European countries, particularly in Germany and Scandinavia and so forth. What I think, so in that period there was a very strong sense in which the good migrants were asylum seekers and the bad migrants were labour migrants that were still trying to get around the closed doors, as it were. Because asylum seekers also, the paradigm, of course, for asylum seeking was partly influenced by the recognition of asylum refugee rights, was partly influenced by the fact that the Germans wanted to keep open the doors to East Europeans and so forth. And the kind of paradigmatic refugee was somebody of that kind. Now, what happened, I think, during the 1980s and 90s was a kind of total reverse in the what was seen as good and bad here, in the sense that the new good migration is one driven by the global economy, and particularly skilled migration, and it could be selected in some sense by the receiving society, either by the economy or by opening doors to point systems. And the bad migrant becomes the fake asylum seeker who's using the old asylum channel to get in really as a labour migrant, but is claiming asylum and then going through these very long processes of being examined and either being deported or eventually given some sort of recognition, in which often it was down to international relations who the good asylum seeker was and the bad asylum seeker. So, as you know, in the US it's always been, in the past it was always driven by the relation to communism. In the present, obviously, it depends on who is the US fighting with at this point in time, etc. very, and I think
That's what we call foreign
no,
policy.
forced.
Yeah,
I always it's difficult because I've never specialised on that side of things, because I've always been interested really in the sense the primary migration driven by the economy, into which forced migration is a problematic category, and I think it is very problematic. Obviously, that it got the whole notion of refugee protection and recognition of rights of asylum, and the need also to recognise sometimes economic and other environmental reasons, say, for requiring asylum. That was also obviously problematic always within the law on refugees. That got soiled really by this kind of the fact that asylum seeking became a kind of channel for labour migration, or got perceived as that, and then became this very negative kind of part of the negative politics of immigration everywhere. I don't know where we stand today with asylum seeking and forced migration. As I said, it's become all the more complex because there are all these other forms of forced migration that fall outside of the 1945 paradigms and post 1945 paradigm, but which need to be recognised, and so it remains a hugely difficult legal question.
I'm just following that, but what you're saying is it's not really a primary force in the populations that you're looking for. Because it's not one of your primary types. I'm just wondering if it's not.
Yeah. I think quantitatively, it has fallen as again a part of the kind of panorama of European migrations. The laws still exist, so there's still potential for asylum recognition, but I think in a holistic kind of global view, you might want to try to attach the inequities in the global economy to notions of forced migration. But I think that kind of path, which I think is taken by some analysts, is always very problematic in terms of the basic legal protection that existed in the first place. So I certainly don't want to deny it in any sense, but just recognise it as a kind of ongoing. It's an ongoing part of the picture, but it's most of the things I'm talking about are driven by different kinds of economic dynamics.
You have the Mediterranean boat people.
Yeah. Well, certainly that would be if there is a crisis, that's a big one right there.
Yeah. But a lot of that migration is problematic if you try and see it as in terms of asylum seeking. I think it's a symptom of the restrictive regime that has got put into place as I argue really that the European solution in some sense was to open to the east and close to the south and try and impose these very draconian barriers to the south and deal with the demographic and labour market demand by sort of looking eastwards and using that to fill that problem, and also get engaged in all kinds of both development and security involvements with sending countries in Africa, for example.
So do you really think we're at an end of the colonial migrations? We've entered some kind of post-colonial, post-national phase here? Do you think the colonial dimension of this is history?
Well, I suppose it's where you think that the ongoing relations, say, with development issues are still captured by colonial questions, whether that's... I was trying to use colonial in the quite narrow sense of specific colonial relations of Britain and France, say, to its old colonies, effectively.
How do you fit the second generation into this, into your...
So second generation, for example, Indians or Pakistanis in Britain,
or any of
even the children of Poles,
the Maghrébins in France, or the sub-Saharan Africans. You started this by talking about how the frameworks that have been imported from the U.S. Do or do not work in the European context, but I think another debate that's increasingly relevant for the Europeans, which is likely to be imported also from the U.S., is what's happening with the second generation, basically. I mean, in France, the idea is to bury this issue completely. You can't talk about second generation in France because they're French.
Well, yeah, that has shifted to some extent. I mean, I think the old stories still apply fairly well to this kind of questions. But it is a national story. It's a national integration, and success stories are effectively also very much stories about the rebuilding of the idea of French or British integration through various examples of migrant groups that apparently have succeeded on sort of second to third generation settlement patterns. Most of those, as I said, were still linked to the old colonial kind of migrations, and have kind of worked through the system. But I suppose I'm kind of more interested in whether that does provide the model, say, for Polish second generation in Britain. Now, I find it hugely problematic if we're saying that the only positive way forward here is that Poles have to become British. Because if that's the case, then the European Union has failed. And effectively, the European Union was an experiment that didn't work in terms of... and I hear this, I've had this kind of
like
reaction
saying somebody from Oklahoma needs to become California.
Often I get Polish researchers listening to this kind of story, and they'll say, but I've got a friend who, they want to get British citizenship, and they're totally buying into this integration idea, and they want to settle, etc. And I say, well, yeah, that's great, but that's just like the old days then. So basically, Polish citizenship is less valuable than British citizenship, and we're actually in a colonial relationship in Europe in that sense. And if that's the case, then the EU has failed, and the EU as a geopolitical integration in which Polish citizenship, a Polish citizen is on the same level as a French citizen living in Britain as well. Because up to this point, at least, we would never dream of that being applied to a French person living in Britain. I mean, the idea that a French person should have to become a British citizen, even their children and so forth, while living and working in Britain, is actually, not really the case. I mean, of course, you can collect citizenships, but that's the kind of distinction I'd want to draw. That's because we don't think French people are inferior in the sense that they don't come from an inferior nationality.
A multicultural colleague here, I think, who has some Italian background, who'd like to
Yes,
get
too, also. No, but I had a question going back to integration. You talked at different times about integration. Do you look and talk about specific mechanisms that promote immigration? And if different countries if there's a European system of integration, or if there are country-specific systems of integration.
Yeah. So one possibility is you still have models of integration. That's something I want to critique maybe from the point of view I'm developing here. That models of integration imply that there are big national differences and they're rooted in political cultures. And the French have their way and the British have their way, and this is still the case. I think this is a bit peculiar in the sense that, on many other levels, these societies are not, they're not sealed boxes. They're internationally integrated economies. They're cultures that are global in many ways, and they're also European in certain sorts of ways. And so that ought to have changed the context, I guess, for talking about integration. But the interesting thing is that it hasn't. The integration is still conceived as a 19th century Durkheimian strong sort of model, which is ultimately kind of ethno-cultural in basis. And that to me is quite problematic as a sociological description of the way. I know there are alternatives. You could integrate into a city, for example. I mean, I think a lot of the people I studied in London, they're not interested in becoming British, but they're very happy to say I'm a Londoner, because that's the world they're integrated in. They're integrated into an international environment in a global city in which Britishness is sort of in the background, but not something that they necessarily have to take on board. And I'm very sceptical that we'll ever get out of the nation state. I mean, I spent 20 years looking for evidence that there might be some kind of post-national or transnational world out there, but the reality is the world is divided up into nation states. The biggest nation state of all is the US, and there's absolutely no way of escaping the US as a nation-building force on immigrants.
That little book, which I think Paula might use
Europe,
in her classes somewhere.
in Europe, there was an experiment, at least for the last 20 years, in a kind of post-national economic space. And we're now seeing that experiment kind of falling apart, I think.
But one of my chapters entitled Le poids du modèle américain, still the weight of the American model. You can't escape the American model. We are out of time, but I can collect a few more questions, and then we can do it a little more informally. Let's see. All right, Sandy, Faith, Hiroki, and then we'll come back to you.
Whatever your comments are.
Yeah, so make them fast. Lynn, you have to run off? Or you're going to get some?
I'm going to run.
Okay, fine.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
My question is whether the integration of pro sports teams might be a counterexample, but I'm thinking of the recent comment by, I think it was a British soccer coach, that we have enough blacks on our team already, which kind of said, okay, the race relations is still there as an element, and perhaps it's another example of the influence of the colonial mindset still happening
Let's
today.
collect these last questions here, Roki.
Former president of the European Central Bank, is it Toshe, is his name? Tishe. He wrote an autobiography in the Japanese newspaper for a month in September, and it was interesting. But he went to U.S. University in the 1960s, I think, and then he found that the U.S. is more racially discriminative than France at that time, and then about 40 years later, he found that the U.S. has an African American president, and then now France. You can never imagine any European country will have African European executive leader in any European state.
Anytime soon.
So, anytime soon. So, question is, what has happened in the U.S. and what has not happened in Europe?
Okay, well, that's a nice, easy question. Faith, and then the lady at the end, and we'll stop there and let Adrian write it up. Yeah.
I was just curious to how your research on this is affected by the constant changing Europe. I mean, I was teaching a class on Europe, and we couldn't even get a map that was up to date. It changed 3 times in that year, and so it's this division of your thinking.
Which is wrong. Which is actually wrong. I can point out what's wrong with it.
I mean, because it used to be, I'm thinking from what you're saying, that people east to the west were celebrated as fleers of communism and welcome, and now it's categorized differently. So is it so much the categorization of nation state that or is it different ideas that's going into who is being othered here?
Yeah, that's another easy question for the end here. Yeah, so you get the last question, and then we'll go back to Adrian.
I guess I was feeling a bit of frustration as we all spoke because of the idea of what is citizenship, what does it mean, and what do people get out of it? One may find that citizenship is just a way to get certain rights or to get certain benefits, in that their understanding their belonging and how they would identify themselves is much different. And I can't help but think about my work in South Sudan, where this new nation is building, and this idea of calling themselves South Sudanese is very new, and no one would start with that, but they would start with I'm Boer Dinka or I'm Yak Nuer. And so I guess wanted to more of a kind of problematize the word citizenship that we're throwing around. And I don't know that we have time for that. So.
Okay, you want to do all that in 5 minutes?
I mean, just briefly, I don't dare say anything about the African context you're mentioning, but obviously the interest here is driven by a notion of whether or not there's something we call European citizenship, and I think a lot of people wanted to connect the classic idea of citizenship to these emerging kind of cross-national or pan-regional space, an idea of European citizenship, to suggest that the kinds of rights and even identity that comes from citizenship could just simply be attached to residency in some sense. And what we've found is that, both in theory, I think, and increasingly on the ground in the politics, is that this is, proving an impossibility. I mean, disassociating citizenship from the nation state has proven, that's a great academic failure of the last 20 years.
Academic failure. You're going to blame it on us.
Post-national membership or no, but
so what happened?
But there was a lot of things that were said in the 1990s that thought that it was going in that direction, and
the universal personhood didn't materialize.
Yeah. There's a lot to be said for Sociology's work on this, but it's certainly not citizenship, and so the citizenship part, if that's what the kind of normative core of politics is, this kind of participation, and thick sense of membership in a kind of community. We haven't, we're not seeing any transcending of that, even in Europe, where they've created an entire institutional structure that's meant to make it possible.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of the issue here. Just briefly on the other things. I mean, I'm going to go backwards. On the othering part of this. Did you notice what was wrong with this map?
Pretty quick latest number.
Is Crimea in here?
Well, apart from the fact that Ukraine's borders have probably changed right now.
You've left out the last member, right?
Sorry, Croatia is of course now a member, so it's now 28.
Yeah.
It's interesting because everybody thought that there was going to be no more enlarging, but still Croatia kind of slipped in under the radar, and that's still driven by a certain sort of geopolitical recognition. I mean, the othering part, it's very. I think this is precisely what I'm interested in, because again, law and politics and economics even would predict that the distinctions should be melting away, and the ideal typical case was the Polish, or maybe even some of the small Latvian states, the Baltic states, such as Latvia, where it would seem to be less problematic. And the Polish case, almost everything has worked almost perfectly. I mean, the Polish economy has been one of the strongest in Europe the last few years. So there's lots of money going back to Poland. There's a kind of fairly fluid, circular kind of dynamic with Western Europe, and particularly with Britain. And bit by bit Poland is evening up, so that it's coming back up, and the migration theory always predicts, of course, that migration will end as soon as there's no differences involved, and it's about as good as you'll ever get with a migration theory, I think, the Polish case, and yet we still have these political problems, these ethnic distinctions, and certainly as regards Romanians and Bulgarians.
Yeah.
And of course what's happened to Turkey in the recent period, that's where one of the biggest shifts has occurred. Because nobody at all is thinking that Turkey is any more a realistic candidate, I think, for the European Union, which is a tragedy for Europe, but and a tragedy for Turkey. But that's what has happened. And now it's kind of the enlargement is over. I think enlargement went from deepening to widening. So all of the energies of Europe went from instead of kind of building a thicker institutional unity towards rather extending it and creating a larger thing that would hold it together because it was geopolitical. Now that's come to an end, and now the question is, can it hold together at all? And the British case is particularly important because I don't think it's the case that Britain can leave Europe and Europe will survive. I think basically Britain has not survived as it is. I mean, Britain is the best model that we have, in a sense, of an integrated European economy in some ways. And if migration, if it fails because of migration in Europe, we're going to see all kinds of rollbacks, I think, across the rest of Europe.
So Cameron's threat is not just idle talk.
Starting with the Netherlands and Denmark, they'll go. Everyone will want to sort of become a nation state again, I think.
Interesting.
Not the French and Germans will probably stick together, but by that stage it's no longer EU. It's just a old Franco-German pact. What happened to race and Obama, and so again I can't say anything about the US and whether or not how positive this remarkable rise of Obama was and so forth. It's, for Americans to debate, but I think that I think there's definitely a case. The French basically, I think this is a path dependency. The French were unable to recognise race properly. They didn't come up with ways of monitoring their minorities, recognising discrimination, recognising that there were different national origins led to ethnicity that persisted beyond the second and third generation. That it didn't just disappear into French universal citizenship, and they, in a sense, paid the price. And race, the racial tensions that then sort of emerged, linked to socioeconomic inequalities, which is what effectively what drives it in France, and ongoing discrimination that had no legal sort of response, I think led to the worsening, in the sense of the racial situation in France. Other aspects of the French integration have worked quite well, but I think, and now I disagree that there's no recognition of it. I think there's a very lively recognition of it amongst a minority of scholars, and also attempts to deal with this issue. I mean, recognise ethnicity.
You would put Simon, Patrick as
Patrick Simon is a good example of somebody. I think he has had influence, and I think that's an ascendant kind of way of looking at things as well. So, but and I don't think most of Europe has not necessarily dealt very well at all with the older, deeper racial issues and relations with Africa and so forth. And I don't think that's really necessarily a positive part of the multicultural picture. And the final point, just the sport. Sorry, the point was about integration of sport. I mean, that was
because the teams have become in many ways integrated with people from all different sorts of
race was something dealt with in Britain quite early on with football. They worked very hard to sort of eliminate this kind of racial discrimination. People saying things during matches, shouting out abuse and that kind of thing was really stamped on. British team, though, the English team actually at one point was very white compared to the French team. The French team actually had a much more multiracial, multi-ethnic team when they won the World Cup.
Like Blanc-Beurre.
And that was where I think Le Pen was, signally out of tune. I mean, he was really out of tune with what had occurred in France as a result of immigration and sports. And that could be celebrated in France, at the same time as Le Pen kind of was making his points. That whole stuff has shifted as well. And I think that the new right in Europe has also tried to shift away from a kind of racial agenda to a kind of cultural agenda, and it's now Islam and also this sort of issues of European mobilities and migration. Like the question of Roma, for example, that's much more likely to be the anti-immigration point than some of the kind of former politics of race and ethnicity that used to motivate these things. And UKIP, for example, is not an all-white party. It has very prominent Asian and West Indian members. And they put them forward, and they also say, too much immigration. We don't want no more immigration.
All right. Well, shall we call it a day? Thanks again. It's a real academic seminar, so we let it go on a bit longer than we had planned. But thanks to you all for.
Thank you.
And some of our staff have stayed.
How's the Africa seminar going?
You're joining us for the